The other interesting thing is, so like let's assume an ODA is like a platoon. Everybody in an ODA is basically like it's a platoon, whatever their platoon comparison is on steroids. I spent a good amount of time at Bragg just because that's where all the training for the Q course and selection is.
Welcome to How I Embraced the Suck, a podcast where you get to hear from veterans what life in the military is really like. I am your host, Walt, and before we start, you should know that I do not censor the show in any way. You have been warned.
Right.
Oh, shoot, dadgummit, and I always do this. I almost never prepare an intro, as dumb as it is. You know, I always try to have something to say, preferably insulting, but the better I know
humbled.
Someone, yeah,
right?
The better I know someone, the easier it is to insult them. So cool.
Part-time troll, full-time amateur.
Yes. Yeah. No kidding. No kidding. Yeah. Cool. Let's see. Yeah, I think should be ready to rumble. So
Let's do it.
Yeah, I'm just realizing some of the guys I interviewed. Yeah, I this will all be new to me. So whatever you have to say, I'm excited because I've only had one other officer.
Okay. Oh God, I'm sorry.
So yeah, it was a struggle, but we managed to get through it.
Right. You got to talk to somebody with the Queen's Commission. They start using big words and faking their intellect.
Yeah. So it's it is kind of nice to get both sides of the spectrum, or both viewpoints. So it should be fun. But
nice.
Yeah. Well, today we have Red, a former Green Beret. So I'm really not crud. I don't want to lose my train of thought. Anyways, we got Red today, a former Green Beret, and I'll just leave it at that because I am spacing. So how's it going, Red?
It's going good, man. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. Thanks for coming on. I appreciate it. This is, like I was saying, it's nice to have an officer on and kind of get the elitist viewpoint on things. No,
I'm just kidding. A little more bourgeois perspective.
Yes, please.
Right.
Yeah. So you were in the Army. You didn't join until after 9/11, but you were saying that that kind of part of why you joined the military.
Yeah, that was actually the reason why. I was in college. I was a sophomore in college on 9/11, and I lived on the West Coast, so I basically woke up to 9/11 while I was in the weight room. And my mom actually worked on the campus that I was going to school to. So I walked into her office, and I thought it was like War of the Worlds because, when I was in elementary and high school, they're like, oh yeah, when War of the Worlds came out on radio or whatever, people were, shitting themselves because they thought it was real. And I'm like, this has got to be something to that effect. It just couldn't possibly happen. And it took probably about 12 hours for me to realize, like, this is going to change the fabric of, my future and probably the rest of the United States future. And there was a bunch of, patriotic, angry feelings that I had. And one thing that had kind of stuck with me is like, I'd felt like I had taken advantage of the freedoms that I was, receiving for very long. And I guess that was, looking back at it, being a college student, I had like a very highfalutin concept of service and the military in general, but that's basically what caused me to join up and did ROTC, and was really, really fortunate to have a lot of really good NCOs that were my instructors. And my dad was an NCO as well. And so I kind of was kind of like Mowgli. I was raised by wolves, so to speak, and got into active duty Army after ROTC, and then just that's how my career began, was that patriotic drive that I think a lot of guys my age at that time had felt, and why you kind of saw that surge of military age males joining in post 9/11.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So you joined, you said '06 is when
Yeah, I
you.
was in at '06, so uh 9/11 happened that
Mhm.
following year. I did ROTC and then got my commission in 2006 and then got into the 101st and did my
Mm,
thing. Yeah.
okay. So I know, like you were saying, right around 9/11, there was a big surge of
hmm
guys wanting to join up. By '06, had that lessened? So were you part of a smaller group of guys
That
joining up,
was
or?
so if you think about it in let's see, post 9/11 you had a large surge of um NCOs that came in. So that's actually kind of
Mm-hmm.
an interesting observation. So you have a lot of NCOs that came in 2001 to basically 2004, where that was like the 18 to 24-year olds that were like, the post 9/11, or like
Sure.
just the right after 9/11 patriots, let's call them. And then when you look at, oh gosh, it would have been 2004, early 2000, or sorry, late 2004 to 2006 was where you saw that surge of officers. And so that's really weird, because when you look at 2016, you see a really large drop off of officers and NCOs as well, because that was their 10-year limit. And they were like, fuck this, I don't want to be in the
Mm,
Army anymore. And so there was ads, or not ads, so refrad cuts that the Army had made in 2016. And it was a
mm-hmm.
lot of those, it's kind of the Army trying to trim the fat with those officers
Sure.
and NCOs. But so like most of the 18 X-rays that are, well, for example, my team sergeant and my warrant were both X-rays, and we got in at the same time. But they have obviously, or sorry, we both basically volunteered at the same time. So
Mm-hmm.
we all wanted to do it in 2002. These guys have 4 more years in service because of them enlisting or whatever.
Sure.
But we both kind of grew up in the same strange generation. So that's kind of how the framework for when officers, or when you kind of see those post 9/11 officers get into the Army.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Hmm. Yeah, I've heard a lot of guys talk about how if you joined right in that time frame, it was hard to pick your job and whatnot, just because they could pick and choose as much as they wanted, just because the recruiters had so many guys signing up.
Yeah, you did.
So,
And really the dudes that came in as X-rays or ended up getting like combat arms MOSs, usually were doing better on the aptitude tests that they were giving them, which was also really
mm,
interesting, because most of my peers are dudes that were a little bit younger than me that I served with, even in the 101st, were either finishing their degrees or already had degrees. And the only thing that was really uh, differentiating us was the fact that I'd stayed in college for a couple years longer, just did a different route. Like there was very little
mm,
social and obviously intellectual differences.
hmm,
Yeah.
yeah. So, so you said you went to the Screaming Eagles. Was that by choice? You wanted to be airborne, or?
Yeah. So I when I finished my third year, my junior year in college, you kind of get like a wish list. And
Mm,
I was stupid and I put the field artillery within my top 5. And at that time, they were hurting so bad for field artillery officers that they just gave it to you if you were in your top 5. So I had like infantry, engineer, armor, and artillery. And they're like, "Oh, you're getting artillery." It's like shit. Um, and my first 2 choices were Bragg and Campbell, which was the 82nd and the 101st.
mm-hmm.
And I got the 101st. And so I'd wanted the 101st, and I didn't necessarily want artillery, but I was happy with what I got. And so I ended up doing there. And I knew that Campbell, was only airborne in history. They weren't jumping out of airplanes, but I actually went through airborne school my sophomore year in college.
Mm,
So for ROTC, if you want, your summers can be spent going to Army schools. And so I went to airborne school my sophomore year, and then my junior year I went to pre-scuba with first group, and then your senior year, well, your junior and junior year, you also do like this summer camp, which is really stupid. And then obviously your senior summer, you're commissioned and you're not in college anymore. But yeah,
Mm.
so I ended
Mm-hmm.
up doing that. I was already airborne, and then I was in the 101st as a field artillery guy. So I was there for, gosh, just about 3 years. And of those 3 years, 15 months was in Iraq. And I split my time in
Mm.
Iraq between being a FSO for an infantry company.
Mm-hmm.
We were just in a small little combat outpost across from the Tigris River into Crit. Um, and it was literally just the company, and we had a small SF team that was attached to us, and we basically got to run our own battle space, which was super unique and pretty fun. And then my other half, I went down to LSA Anaconda, and I got put in a firing battery as a gun platoon leader and kind of did the generic field artillery thing.
Mm.
Because we weren't shooting cannons at the time in Iraq, though, I was basically an infantry platoon leader again. So that was kind of fun. I got a lot of exposure to kind of the non-field artillery side of everything.
Mm.
Um,
Okay.
Met a lot of SF dudes, and kind of did the light infantry thing while I was there, and I knew I'd always wanted to do it. My dad was a special forces medic. The NCOs in our OTC, one of them was a Delta Force Sergeant Major, the other one was from Ranger Regiment, and so I knew like I wanted to be among that community of people, and so I knew coming back from Iraq, um, when I'd gotten back to Fort Campbell, I wanted to be part of that community, and so I put my application in to go to assessment and selection. Got selected, and then went through the pipeline for the special forces qualification course.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Is that Yeah, I haven't really. I read about that kind of stuff as a kid, but is
hmm
that the same as Green Beret? You're talking
Yeah,
about
that's the
the
same
the
thing. Yeah.
class or the qualification rather. Okay.
Yeah, so when you go to selection, that's basically like the test to see if you're like trainable and if you're
Okay.
even
Sure.
if you're even like worthwhile, right? And so it's 2 weeks. They do a bunch of physical and mental tests, and then the last week they have team week, which is you're in a obviously a team environment. You're trying to move some sort of contraption or some sort of weighted device a specific distance while trying to manage your team, and usually they have like a three-wheeled jeep or some sort of like water can carry where you have to hoist it on these heavy ass metal bars, and so you've got to
Mm.
manage personalities and motivate your dudes to get to a specific point. And the nice part is they do it across enlisted and officer ranks,
Mm-hmm.
to kind of gauge you know what type of personality you are, and then also to see if you're worth throwing into the Q course. And then the Q course has its own pipeline that's almost a year long depending on what MOS you are, and then each specialty kind of has their own flavor, but you go through a lot of the same unconventional warfare block checks for language and consolidated training like SEER school and stuff like that.
Mm. Okay.
Yeah.
Sure. Sure. Yeah, that's interesting. You mentioned that they mix ranks. Um, I've known or I've heard that in the special forces community, there's a lot less emphasis placed on ranking, a lot more camaraderie. So it's interesting that from the start they're kind of embracing that. It
Yeah,
sounds like.
you really, I mean, when you're at selection, you're just a number. And the only people that really know that you're an officer off the bat are the instructors.
Mm-hmm.
It becomes kind of apparent if you've been in the Army for long enough. You can basically just look at somebody, tell how old they are and kind of tell their personality.
Sure,
Um,
sure.
and the nice part is though is because you don't have rank, you don't have a name, and you are a number. Nobody can kind of pull bullshit with anybody else, and then and
Mm.
you end up once you get to team week, since it's almost all over, you and your students are basically just moving towards a common goal, and you don't care if this dude's an X-ray or if he's a senior NCO or if he's an officer. You're just trying to do the work, and parts of the Q course are like that too. Language, usually you're on a last name or first name basis with most of your fellow students, and it really
Mm-hmm.
doesn't get too wild until when you're using rank until really close to the end of the training, so you can kind of better define what your roles are. And that's been the
Mm.
interesting thing in that community is you know a good team or a good relationship, the relationship you have with the guys it's predicated off of your job, not necessarily like what rank you are. And because you're the captain, you're in charge of planning the overall picture and enabling your NCOs to succeed in the mission. It's
Mm-hmm.
not you have a part to play in this whole dynamic, and you aren't the dynamic. Like, a lot of times the Army kind of puts the emphasis on platoon leaders or company commanders. So it's a nice thing because you have the backbone of the military kind of being the backbone in that team environment. Yeah.
Sorry. Wow, totally lost it. You're
Right.
yeah, I'm sounding really, really intelligent today. No, you were. I'm obviously not officer material. um,
You'd be all right.
yeah, probably. Right up to general.
Right.
Um, no, yeah, and then also the value. That's what I was thinking. The value you bring, your value isn't based on your rank, but on the skills and what you're bringing to the table.
Yeah, right. You're
Personally,
not.
yeah.
Yeah, and
Hmm.
that's the funny thing too is as a PL, everybody kind of tells you as a platoon leader in an infantry company, everything that happens or fails to happen falls on you, and you feel that way as an officer on a team. But at the same
Mm.
time, like, everybody has buy-in on the team. Like, everybody in that environment plans something.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas in an infantry platoon, it's you and your platoon sergeant, maybe your squad leaders. You're planning movement or whatever. But you have to have buy-in from your guys when you're planning missions, or when you're honestly just painting the future of what your team needs to look like. And the best,
Hmm.
I think the best explanation you can do is, you're kind of middle management, and these guys, work with you to, move your business or move your team, towards whatever goals they have. It's nice because it is a really dynamic environment, and you
Mm-hmm.
can, if you have the right personalities for the team, and you manage them right as the team leader. It's you can have a really fun time, just being a shitty little captain on a team.
Did yeah, okay, so did that a level of allowed camaraderie ever negatively impact um a decision you had to make? Where
No,
maybe maybe the guys under you got more chippy back or something in a
no,
negative way? Or
you
was
know,
it
I've always, and maybe I don't know if it's like a brag or what it is, but
Fort Bragg?
like, yeah, right. No, there's always I don't know, you always have guys that do get a little bit chippy, but
Mhm.
if through like leadership, you don't teach them. Like, you build your comfort zone between like a time and a place. And I've never had a time where I've had dudes that have kind of crossed the line with kind of like insubordination, and that's because the conversation I had with my team sergeant or my warrant or the senior dudes on the team is, I've kind of set that boundary of like,
Mm,
where I stand in that
sure.
relationship. And
Sure.
it's not the because everybody's always gonna be like, I'm not your fucking friend. Like, this is how I do, and that's definitely not me. Like, my team sergeant and I aren't friends, but like, that dude's like my brother, right? And so he and I
Mhm.
don't like go out and drink on the weekend. Like, we don't hang out a lot, but like, when the uniform comes on, or when we deploy, or when we're drilling together, like, I have a relationship just like family with him. And maybe that's probably the best comparison is,
Hmm.
you're not always doing stuff with your extended family or your brother or your cousins, but like, the relationship you have with them when you meet back up, it's like you never miss a beat. And
Mhm.
so that's how it
Yeah.
is with a lot of those dudes. And that's probably the closest thing too is, even when like, they're tying your boots together, or they're zip tying, all your shit to your bag. Like, it's never one of those things where, it's out of disrespect. Like, when I was in the infantry, every time, dudes would play jokes on you, you realize it's like, they're doing this because they love you, not because they hate you. Like, you can
Right.
kind of feel that vibe. And I've been fortunate enough to not to have that, ever happen to me. I've seen it happen with some dudes, and to counter that, I've also seen dudes that have gotten too friendly with dudes on their team, and they've had to make some really shitty calls, and it's kind of imploded on the team, and
Mm.
it does become kind of a fine line to walk for some personalities. But I think I don't honestly don't know what like the answer to it is because I've been thankful enough to have it happen organically.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah.
What? Oh crud! I need to write these questions down. You were talking about. Oh yeah, the camaraderie, or just the relationships you've had.
Yeah.
Now that you're out, you're still in the reserves, but now that you're out of the regular army, has that have those relationships persisted, especially in this day and age where it's so easy to stay connected remotely? Um, or was that kind of a situation where in the moment you're just super tight, you're relying on each other, and then once you separate ways,
Yeah,
things are looser?
I always it's almost like kind of a parental thing as bad as a comparison as that is. So
Mm-hmm.
most of the guys that I had a good relationship with, the 101st, I keep in touch with on Facebook, and we chat every now and again. And if they ever need anything, I'm always there to kind of have a conversation with them. Um,
Mm,
I've
sure.
got a couple medics that I talk to on kind of a bi-monthly basis, and then there's a guy that just got commissioned as a finance officer that asked for a recommendation, which I loved to be able to do that for guys. So it's yeah, it was I kind of watch them as they grow, even though I may not like speak to them directly. Like I'm always kind of stalking them on Instagram or Facebook to see them grow up like I guess a parent does, and
Sure.
then
Yeah, yeah.
the dudes that I had on my first team, um, I keep in touch with. There's one commander that I had that was my company commander when I was in seventh group that I probably talk to, once a month to check in, let him know how I'm doing, and kind of
Hmm.
thank him for his guidance. So it's yeah, the relationships are still there and they're still lasting. But for the most part, you know, I don't personally see a lot of dudes where I am outside of like the guys that I'm currently working with.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I mean, it's kind of weird as an officer because I feel like you don't build that relationship like you do like NCO to NCO or enlisted guy to enlisted guy. You always have like
Sure.
you were in truck one if you were the O, but the relationship in truck one is the gunner and the driver, and then the dude in the back. Like those guys are a lot tighter than normally than they'll be with than the officer
Mm,
sitting in the truck. And it
sure.
was like I keep in touch with my dudes in my truck, but Doc and the gunner were best friends, and they were in the same containerized housing unit, and they played Guitar Hero together all the time. And so it's like those dudes are brothers. I'm basically just like the weird dad that
Right.
watches them and yeah has to
And
wipe
embarrasses
their
them at
butts.
all
Yeah,
the
exactly,
functions.
right. Yeah, it always gets them lost in the truck or whatever.
Oh. um, did you deploy just to Iraq or?
No, I went to Iraq for 15 months. That was my first deployment.
Okay.
And that was when Petraeus was there. So we were like the 15-month surge. And so we got
Mm,
told, like right before we left, we're like, oh yeah, we're just going to tack on another 3 months to deployment. And I was like, whatever, 15 months, no big deal. And like thinking about being gone for 15 months now, it's like, hell no, like it sounds terrible. So did that. And then when I was in special forces in seventh group, I did 1 month in Afghanistan, and they were tearing our fire base down. So we all dipped out of there pretty quick, and then
mm,
went to Central and South America. Did a little bit of time in Colombia and El Salvador and Honduras and Guatemala. Got to see a lot of that. So I was one of the few SF guys that was lucky enough to do most of my deployments outside of a combat zone initially, and then just went to South America and got to do a bunch of counter drug stuff. And I got a really unique kind of insight into a lot of the other shit that happens, that was happening outside of the war on terror, which was unique
mm,
and fun.
sure.
Um, and then I got out of so I left the team environment, and I got put on a staff job for about 2 years up at Special Forces Command during the ISIS crisis or whatever you want to call it in Iraq. And so I got to see everything at a strategic level and see how all the groups operate and see what was really going on, globally, which was it
Mm,
was terrible. Like it was genuinely painful, but it was very eye opening at the same time because it showed you like, this is what the whole enterprise is doing as a whole, which was amazing.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, got out of active duty, got into the part timer thing, and then did a deployment in Africa during the height of COVID, which was great because nobody in Africa gave two shits about COVID.
Oh, okay.
And it was like you show up to Africa and everybody's got a mask on and you're getting laughed at and you're like, what? Why are you laughing? And they're like, bro, this is Africa. We've got bigger problems than COVID. I was like, fair
Sure.
enough. So we went up there and I went to Niger and got to spend some time at a base where a couple years ago some Green Berets died, and so it was a tense situation for a few months. And then once we had built some good relationships with the Nigerian military, and saw what we were kind of up against, it got really interesting. I got to spend a lot of time with the French Foreign Legion. I got a lot of really interesting,
Hmm.
unique experiences in a quite honestly like a very austere, at times terrifying place that I think most people would not want to
Mm.
imagine being in. But it was a lot of fun.
Sure.
Yeah,
Huh. Yeah. That's yeah. Both. That is interesting because Africa and then, like you're saying, South America, the war on terror takes so much bandwidth in the news and
yeah.
everything that's. I mean, I don't know that it's mentioned much. So,
Right. But if
huh?
you look, if
Interesting.
you,
Mm-hmm.
when if you dig, a few feet deep, you see all the stuff that's going on in Mexico, and you see
Mm-hmm.
how crazy the cartels are there, and the amount of, people being displaced out of Central America, and you're like, oh shit, it's pretty wild, and especially Honduras, or how wild it can get. And then you go to Africa, and it honestly, I think it's just because it's not sexy, right? Like nobody really cares that 5 or 6 French people were killed at a giraffe park in Africa,
Right.
but when you're there, it's like holy shit! Like these are the only other white people in this country, and like they're actively being hunted by this
Mm.
ISIS terrorist organization. And these people, I mean, it's like you when you're there, or when you kind of see it firsthand, you kind of get the context of it. And it's like, oh damn, this is genuinely terrifying. But it's
Right.
it's it's definitely interesting too, because you can, most people, or Americans especially, look at like, what conflict are we in, or what are we looking at in terms of conflict globally? And all we see now is, maybe Ukraine, and in the past Afghanistan and Iraq. But when you
Mm-hmm.
look at, almost every third world nation, you've got problems that are either on the non-governmental scale, where you have like, cartels or terrorist organizations, or you've got unrest in Mali. Like it gets pretty wild when you take a few minutes and look at, what's going on globally.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And being in special forces, especially when you were in, you'd probably be more likely to be involved in those situations than a regular line grunt or something, I would think.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, you're going to, like, the war on terror was the main game.
Mm-hmm.
But like those groups had to maintain a presence in those areas. And so there had always been dudes in Eastern Europe and Africa, and the Pacific Rim and South America, and it didn't get the attention, obviously, that the global war on terror did. But those guys were still exposed to some of the crazy stuff that we don't really hear too much about very often.
Mm-hmm.
And what's weird is it's not even necessarily combat, but you're training a host nation army to go out and do that. And what's really interesting is, you lead a platoon of dudes in Africa to go out and fight this enemy element on a border, and you're not able to go and fight with them, but you're at a base that they're, is basically like their stopover.
Okay.
They go out, they fight, they come back and provide you information, and 10 or 15 of their guys that died in that conflict. And it kind of like,
Hmm.
hits you in a very similar way that if you had been there in some senses has, right? Like the guys that you just trained, you lost 15 of them, and it's like, well shit, I wish I could go out and do that. And so it's interesting to uh in the non-global war and terror sense, like still see that weird proximity to combat that a lot of SF dudes are still kind of dealing with.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Hmm. Do you think, like you were talking, the group comes back and some guys didn't? Do you think that hits you harder having been in that situation and being able to participate, and then now your hands are kind of tied, so to speak?
I think there's definitely some form of like I don't want to call it survivor's guilt, but there's definitely that guilt where as an
Oh,
American,
sure.
and most of the dudes that I had on my team came from some pretty heavy hitting organizations, and so like those guys had been uh, they'd been in Iraq during the dark times where there were houses blowing up and dudes, special operations elements losing tens of guys on hits, and so they got
Yeah.
super frustrated because they train these guys to go fight, and then they would have their partner force come back, and they'd lost guys, and we'd had a lot of arguments and conversations of
Hmm.
why we couldn't go out and do that, and the global implications of it, and the issues of why we can't why we can't go out and fight with these guys, because how awful would it look to lose an American in Africa when people
Right.
don't even know we're there, right? It's just
Right.
this weird dynamic that you have to educate a dude that's just been stomping asses in Afghanistan for the last 5 or 6 years, right?
Right.
It's like, why
Yeah.
not?
That's
We used to do this all the time. They're like, but we have a unique situation, and that's probably the most officery thing to do, is try and convince a dude to do a job that you kind of wish you could too. It's like, shit, I
right.
wish I could go out and do that with those guys, but we're all going to get fired if we go out and try and get our gun on.
Yeah. Hmm. A lot of, or I would think, I'm not everybody, but my impression would be that a lot of people kind of view airborne as kind of not maybe not exactly special forces, but kind of a step above, you know.
Yeah.
So since you already were in airborne, what were some of the differences between airborne and then the special forces um, environment
Oh
as
gosh.
far as
So
units and stuff?
yeah. So if you look at like a regular 82nd line unit, you've got like an infantry platoon, and a company. And so, in terms of mission wise, the 82nd, or any infantry platoon, is kind of your generic combat arms element. The 82nd's job is to seize airfields, and the Ranger Regiment can do that too.
Hmm.
And the Special Forces mission is a mixture of unconventional warfare and foreign internal defense. And so, what it basically really boils down to is we train guerrilla forces to fight or resist belligerent nations, and we do it on behalf of American interests, right? And so the best examples like Vietnam, or training Colombians to fight the FARC. And the counter of unconventional warfare is foreign internal defense, where we go and train a friendly host nation military to combat insurgent or foreign military elements, which is,
Hmm.
we go to Niger or Mexico, and we train their friendly nation military to fight the cartel, or fight ISIS. So that's basically what SF's job is. They're trainers, like historically they've been trainers since the global war on terror, because most of these guys came from units, and they become, or sorry, not didn't just come from units, they came from combat arms units, and
Hmm.
they became masters in their craft. They did a lot more direct action stuff, which you would usually see infantry units, or even SEALs in some respects, or Ranger Regiment do, and we did it on a much smaller scale. So we'd have like alpha bases or VSOs, village stability locations, and we'd kind of be in this austere environment with some peppering of infantry dudes, and we'd go out and try and bring stability to these areas, or try and fight the insurgents within these areas. And so the mission set for SF guys is, it can be really, really broad, or it can be really, really finite, depending on the environment we're in, and the problem set that we're basically presented.
Mm.
And so that's kind of the mission difference. So the structure of it is usually, so an infantry company has uh, three platoons plus a weapons section, like a mortar section, and then they have a headquarters and element.
Hmm.
A special forces company has 6 ODAs, and each ODA is a team, or considered a team. You've got a team leader. The second in charge is a warrant officer. You've got a team sergeant. Then you have two guys from each MOS, and the MOSs are weapons, engineering,
Mm.
medical, and communications. And then you also have an intel sergeant. So
Okay.
The other interesting thing is, so like let's assume an ODA is like a platoon. Everybody in an ODA is basically like it's a platoon, whatever their platoon comparison is on steroids. So instead of a lieutenant as the PL, it's a captain. Instead of
Okay.
a sergeant first class, it's a master sergeant. You're second in charge. You really don't have one in a platoon other than your, platoon sergeant, but you actually have another officer, which is a warrant officer. And then everybody on that team is usually no lower than the rank of staff sergeant. And so you've got guys that,
Mm.
in the regular army could either be sergeant majors or first sergeants, or at the very least squad leaders, kind of acting as a team leader or, the most basic unit in that team environment. And so you've got a real wealth of knowledge on a team where in a platoon, you know, your 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 head shed, so to speak, is basically your platoon sergeant and your team leader. On an ODA, it's more like an octopus. It's just kind of spread out everywhere. That's actually kind of a good comparison. I just thought of that.
Right. Right.
Um, and even how you view planning and how you employ everything is just kind of, it's a little bit more roided up. So when you're
Mm.
as a team plans, they use the military decision making process, which is a multi-step planning process where a platoon does the op order and troop leading procedures, which is just basically preparation for an operation. So it's a lot more I wouldn't say the word is intense, but it's just a lot more time consuming, and it requires a lot more critical thinking than kind of reaction that it would take in a platoon. And they test that and they evaluate a lot of that as you go through the Q course. And so those are kind of the two things that set it apart. And
Hmm.
it becomes an even more unique situation because there's not really many other elements across the Department of Defense that do UW. A lot of dudes do direct action and they kick doors and they blow shit up. Almost everybody else does that, but there's kind of only one element that does unconventional warfare, that does training guerrillas and does this whole teaching thing, and it's Green Berets that do it.
Hmm. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I just realized. Were you in the 82nd?
No,
Or
I
was
was
it
in the
101st?
101st.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Good, because I was first. Long story short, I thought I was all confused. And I was looking back at the email. I was like, wait, did he say 82nd? I was like,
Nah,
I was
I
scrambling.
spent
Okay. All right.
I
Cool.
spent a
Cool.
good amount of time at Bragg just because that's where all the training for the Q course and selection is. And then
Mm-hmm.
I was at Bragg after 7th group, and so it just kind of kept me, I was never in the 82nd, but I got a lot of neighborly love from them,
Okay.
so to speak.
so to speak.
Yeah,
Emphasis on
love.
neither neighborly or love.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Right.
I bet. Huh. One. Yeah, I was wondering. You mentioned but before we started recording, or you emailed me about the um your thoughts on the civilian perception of combat and PTSD, and I was really curious what you had about that. What your thoughts were.
Yeah, it's man, it's a weird slippery slope because I think
Yeah,
there's
sure.
definitely a lot of dudes out there that have a form of PTSD. Even dudes that you probably don't think they do in some sense,
Mm-hmm.
probably relive some circumstances in their head that they've seen playing out. And there's plenty of people that haven't seen combat in the military that also have PTSD, and there's
Mm.
people that have served in the military that are victims of PTSD because of other circumstances completely unrelated to even deploying. And so like it's this really weird layered onion of a lot of crazy issues that have a habit of manifesting themselves a lot of times very differently within people. And I think because initially um the way we viewed returning veterans and the way we viewed PTSD, and I think it's gotten a little bit better. But usually it's just like, oh, he's got PTSD. Like, first of all, it's this like concept that he's damaged. And then the second thing
Mm.
is like, is he prone to violence? Right. And at
Mm-hmm.
first I was like, that's definitely not the case. Like, people are far more educated now when it comes to the military because we've been at war for 20 years. And what's really weird is like, there's some people that have just kind of lived in the post 9/11 world and, thank the military, but haven't really taken the time to educate themselves on what PTSD looks like when it manifests or whatever. And so it's still like,
Mm-hmm.
I hate saying it's stereotypical, but there's this like stereotypical civilian reaction of like, oh, he's got this. This means he's going to like fly off the handle. On the
Sure.
counter side too, though, is I think a lot of people, not a lot of people, there are definitely people that are taking advantage of that stigma to their benefit. And it's really easy to fake a lot of the um, symptoms, so to speak, of PTSD to the point where if you have the credentials to say that you got it, right? So like, oh, I was deployed and
Mm-hmm.
I saw a dead body, right? Or you reported that you saw a dead body, or you saw something happen. It's really hard to basically tell somebody, it's like, no, motherfucker, you didn't, you don't have this. You're just using this for your benefits. But you can
Mm.
definitely tell
Sure.
based on interactions with a lot of people that they're kind of faking the funk. Um, there are definitely there are though definitely some dudes that have to kind of face their demons every day. And I think you see a lot. I mean, the veteran community has a massive issue with suicide. I mean, active duty,
Mm.
the military in general just has a massive
Sure.
suicide issue,
Yeah.
and their only response really is like, don't be sad and don't kill yourself, and it doesn't really work out very well. Um, and I think that's kind of indicative of the amount of people that are probably suffering in silence from a lot of demons and a lot of issues that they've kind of brought home in some respects.
Mm. Yeah. Yeah. I recently heard a fella talk about his concern about a veteran. He was his concern about how suicide in the military was presented is that it kind of um it the publicity of it in the public eye kind of encourages veterans to embrace that as a persona. And excuse me, not embrace. But it can breed that in their
Oh
mind.
yeah,
That
yeah.
makes sense. So he was encouraging vets to not focus on that, but instead focus on who you are as a person and not the statistics that you might be a part of, but instead succeed in life.
And I
That was
think
kind of interesting. Yeah.
I want to say like it's an anomaly too, because when it happens in like clumps. Um, and I don't know
Hmm.
if it's anecdotal. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
I have not seen any statistics that say it, but I feel like when that happens in an organization, like you almost see as like a rash of it. And unfortunately, the closest
Mm.
anecdote I have is like is quitting. So when you see people in a really tough, stressful situation, and you see one person quit, it's never one person. Ranger school,
Oh, sure.
selection, whatever, you have one dude quit, and it's like a rash of quitters. Now, I mean, it's not an appropriate or necessarily good comparison, but I feel like there's kind of a similar calling card where I mean, I saw it in seventh group where one dude took his life, and then literally a week after it was another guy, and then 2 days after it's another guy, and it was like, holy shit, this is an
Sure.
issue. And
Mm-hmm.
I think the unfortunate thing is the military's never really treated mental health in a critical eye, and it is hard because so much of your job is predicated on your ability to maintain your clearance and your ability to be a functioning soldier. And if you're taken out of the fight, it's like this stigma of you being a shitbag, and it's like, well, I don't want to be a shitbag, so I'll
Mm.
basically bury these problems. And it
Mm.
really, I don't want to say it hasn't changed, but it hasn't gotten better to the point where we're completely clear of that stigma. Most commanders will say, it's not a stigma anymore. But if you still see dudes losing your clearance, and you still see guys that kind of get put in this limbo, it's like, you see it as this weakness. And then the problem is
Mm.
obviously it just continues to perpetuate and continues to get worse. And then you have guys killing themselves, and then then you have commands losing their shit over, what's going on, and it's just this like wicked cycle of, how do we fix this problem? And I definitely
Hmm.
don't know the answer to it, but it's obviously a problem.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Huh. Yeah, and it's far reaching too, the effects, like you're saying.
Oh yeah.
Hmm.
And you see it
Yeah.
in every community, right? You see SEALs, you see this operator syndrome hitting a lot of guys in special operations because they ate a lot of charges, breaching rooms and stuff. And you've got guys that are having, serious heavy metal not deficiencies. They've got heavy metal traces in their body,
Mm,
and so
yeah.
like you've got this. I think you have a really weird underlying health crisis that will probably bloom in the next 20 years. And
Mm,
I think it'll be on par with Agent Orange. I think you'll see, and it'll be much more prevalent in the special operations community, but just the burn pits and a lot of the exposure dudes had to deal with in the Middle East too will just kind of, generally, I think it's going to rear its ugly head in the next decade or so when guys get older and more broke.
hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. I have wondered about that. Maybe you don't, if you have any thoughts on it. Um, the the increase in the public eye of PTSD and all these things, like, has that never happened in the past? I mean, people have been fighting wars forever.
Yeah.
Um, the modern warfare is of a different, maybe a different style. Um, but why the recent increase in publicity?
Well,
Is
it's,
it
it's
more
a,
common, you think, or?
well, I think it's a product of history too. So that's actually a really interesting question because when you look at each major war, or you look at like a large enough conflict where you can look at PTSD and its and how it manifests itself. I don't know a lot about World War One in terms of PTSD, other than just like shell shock was a big thing, and it
Mm,
was
hmm.
genuinely terrifying. And I think a lot of dudes in World War One just either like came home fucked up or they didn't. World War Two was interesting because there's a few veterans that talk about before they before they got to England or before they got into theater, they were on a ship for weeks, with each other and
Mm,
kind
hmm.
of just like, broing out on this ship. And then after the war, they got put back on the ship and they like had time to decompress and they had time to talk to each other and figure their shit out and like almost,
Mm,
absorb what had actually happened. And that isn't to
sure.
say that dudes didn't come back completely fucked up and, still relive a lot of their monsters, but there's definitely something to be said about spending 2 weeks on a ship with dudes that you just came back from combat with and like kind of decompressing. And there's a few instances where guys talk about that. World War II vets talk about that. Vietnam is a really good example of just like, you know, uh, a complete lack of compassion, not compassion, maybe empathy or the
Hmm.
need to understand PTSD. And that's why you see, the soldiers that served in Vietnam is kind of just this like lost generation of soldier where they're dealing with PTSD now, but it's being dealt with now, but it's far too late to address. And so a lot of these guys are, their peers are either dead or living with their own demons and they're not able to really reconnect. And, these are a lot of the dudes that you go to the, Foreign Legion, you go to a military bar with and kind of have a conversation with and, realize these dudes were Vietnam vets and they
Mm,
came home and got spat on. And so it's like this, that dynamic. There's PTSD was obviously a thing, but it just wasn't, the nobody really gave two shits about those guys. And
sure.
here I think
Sure.
because, it's this post 9/11, um, thank you for your service, support the troops environment, you see a lot of people that are head nodding, yeah, 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 we need to handle this PTSD situation. And I think it's done in good spirits, like with the effort of hoping that they can support it. And then
Mm,
when
sure.
you look at it, it's like, well, I don't know how to help it, right? And it's like, we want to help the soldiers, show us how to help the soldiers. And so like I think each generation gets its kind of whack at how we take care of it. And I'd say we're doing a better job than a lot of a lot of generations before us. But I also think it's totally predicated on circumstances, right? We don't have that opportunity to come back, you know, and hang out on a boat with our dudes and figure out, what we just saw. Additionally,
Mm,
this war, you would go over there for 6 months to a year. You'd come back home for a year, and then you go back 6 months to a year. And it was almost like this roller coaster of stress, where you'd 3
mm,
months out, you'd be,
sure.
shitting your pants because you're going back to Iraq, and then you go to Iraq and then you kind of go back down the slope and you chill out for a little bit, and then you're about to go back up, and it's this like, this ebb and flow of wildness. And you could definitely tell dudes that had higher tempos in terms of, they'd be gone for 6 months, they'd be home for 6 months, they'd be gone for 6 months. Their families
Mm.
had either just completely collapsed because they just couldn't, they were not sustainable,
Yeah.
or dudes that just, basically live in this weird, social limbo where they never really had enough time to recollect on what had happened. And by that time they'd already, they basically start a whole nother layer of trauma on top of what they had just dealt with.
Mm.
So I think you'll see, I think you'll see smatterings of, kind of dudes have that World War II moment where they go back home and they talk to their buddies and they figure out what's happening on the downtime. And then you'll probably see dudes that have that kind of Vietnam PTSD where it's just this layer upon layer upon layer of, trauma.
Yeah, I tend to agree that it's something important to talk about and be aware of. Um, I've often wondered, and maybe you have input, what your thought is personally when you hear about civilians, non-military members, um, getting talking about it or being concerned about it or whatever. Do you think, like you were saying, it comes from a good place? Do you
Yeah.
how? Hmm. I'm trying to think how to phrase my question. But what is that kind? That's pretty much your response to it. Just that, depending on the person, obviously, but it's something that can be appreciated, but maybe they don't really quite understand what they're
Yeah.
talking
Well, and
about.
and it that even varies within the military, right? Like, you have guys, even in the community, you've got guys that have seen some pretty crazy stuff. And if you really haven't lived it or you haven't lived close to it, then it's really, really hard to fathom.
Mm,
And, it's even as a Green Beret, when I think about seeing some of the stuff my peers have done or that guys that I know have done and they explain it, it's like it's like a illustration of a movie. You can imagine this happening, but it's really difficult
mm,
to put yourself in that mindset of where it's happening, right? And it's like, oh yeah, I've been shot at, I've been blown up, I can imagine this thing happening. But it's
mm-hmm,
like, man, you can't really explain the fear of actually thinking you're going to get overrun and either captured or killed unless you've been in that environment. And then so like that's within the SF community, and then within the military community, how do you explain to somebody how terrifying it is to have a truck thrown 40 feet and have doors blown open and dudes hanging out? And it's like, you can imagine that,
hmm,
but
yeah,
the fear you experience is very, it's very different than just like knowing what happens. And so it's,
sure,
it's just a it's from a civilian standpoint, it is reassuring that people kind of appreciate the gravity of like what it does or how it manifests. But it's so difficult, for anybody to kind of explain it. And that's kind of the weird thing too, is like, how do you
hmm,
explain to a psychologist that's never handled this? He's like, well, this is clearly a terrifying situation. It's like, yes, of course it is.
mm,
However, like, it's hard to explain. It's like self-diagnosing how you know, uh, stop living through your trauma, or stop,
mm-hmm,
how do you stop being sick? It's like, I don't know, take some vitamin C and I guess get better. Like, how do you get over this issue that you clearly need help getting over? It's like,
hmm,
you probably have to find people in your community that have been through those things, and, hopefully you can live through it together, which I think, when you look at World War II or you look at veterans that have done that, that's kind of what they do, is they've, find like-minded individuals. They get in, circles or whatever, where they're, checking up on each other and building relationships, and they can kind of understand the, the avenue that they're coming from in terms of where their trauma is coming
mm-hmm,
from.
yeah, yeah. I've heard that some guys when they get out, um, have gotten a house together with other guys for the
Yep.
military, and they say that's been just remarkably helpful.
Yeah.
Just like you're saying, if they don't have, in World War II, they had, say, 2 weeks in a boat with nothing else but other guys around them. Whereas, if they get back, and live in the same house, it's not as intense of a time. But if you're living together for a year or so, you kind of have the same experience of just like decompressing and
Right. And you
you
can
know.
kind of voice your. That's the weird thing is, you can voice whatever occurred, or you can kind of have a conversation with somebody that knows what it feels like, and so you don't feel like their response is
Sure.
contrite or fabricated, right? It's like, I've been there, I've seen that, like I know how that happens, and so you have kind of an already, established connection with somebody that has those
Hmm.
experiences.
Yeah. Yeah. As I think as a civilian, that's been one of the maybe most valuable or biggest things that I've realized is um, there's a lot of things I can't relate to,
Right.
and to pretend to is more insulting than to acknowledge that I can't,
Right.
So I can understand how if I'm talking to a vet and I'm like, oh, what was it like? They're just like, I don't want to talk to you. I
Right.
don't want to
Right.
talk to you. Go away. So you weren't there. Shut up, dude.
Well, and that's the
So
funny thing too is like, I know dudes that are like, how do I explain this? Or I don't want to explain this. I don't want to talk about this. And
hmm
I got a really interesting when I was getting out, the guy that my commander at the time was basically like, tell your story, tell whatever story you can to people, so they at least understand what they're what they're getting for their
mm,
tax dollars. But what he was saying is like, it's almost your obligation to tell these people what your experience was, because it's not just your experience, right? Like it's part of the, for if I'm being really corny, it's like part of the American experience, right? Where it's like, I'm not just some dude
mm,
that went over and volunteered to go fight a war. Like I was doing it on behalf of, a lot of other people that couldn't or didn't want, or didn't want to now or whatever. But it's worth telling
hmm,
those stories, because you don't just get the war story. You get the story about the cook that sat in the chow hall for the whole deployment, and like builds a larger picture of what really happens in war, as opposed to just like Blackhawk Down all the time, or the Outpost
mm.
all the time, or this like experience. So it is worth knowing a lot of that stuff, and sometimes you just get these really interesting funny gems of human interaction that are just in this weird military environment that don't have anything to do with war.
Hmm. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. People will readily say that war, kind of like flying, is 99% boredom and 1% sheer terror. But then when
Oh,
they're talking to a
100%.
vet, then when
Right.
they're talking to a vet, they just want to hear about the terror and
Yeah,
and
right.
the exciting moments. And it's like, what about the rest of my life
Yeah, right. I
that
ate
I
Girl
expect?
Scout cookies, lifted weights, and looked at porn. That was about it.
Right, right, yeah, huh? Yeah,
No
that's
different than any other normal human being.
right, right. What one thing I try to ask everybody, assuming there's people listening to this that are of the right age and are willing to take advice. If a kid was to ask you, hey, I want to join the military, what's your advice? What would you give them? What would you say in response?
Honestly, there's some people that would advise against it. For
Mm,
whatever
hmm.
political reasons or what have you. Honestly,
Sure.
I'm still all about it. You're always going to have issues with administrations or organizations, but there's very few experiences that will build the relationships and brotherhood that the military will. And even if you never deploy, there's something to be said about an environment where you're mutually suffering, whether it's just suffering in the rain in a training exercise or basic training. It
Yeah.
kind of
Yep.
builds a relationship that you can't really replicate in the civilian world. And I think, just even if you just get exposed to those experiences, you're you're going to come out of an organization, or you have the potential to come out of that organization much more mature and with a lot more kind of context of what suffering or like work is, than a lot of civilians. So I would recommend it.
Hmm.
I would also say, like, if you're going into it, have a clear picture of what you want, right? Like, try, like any other job, go in with an idea of what you want. What do you want to be? What do you
Mm,
feel like you're going to get out of it? Because so many people go in and they're like, well, I just want to serve my country because it's the honorable thing. And while that is those things, like when you leave, the Army is not going to give two shits about you. They don't care. I mean, they honestly don't give
Mm,
two shits about you when
sure.
it comes to, your job or whatever. Like when you leave, they're not gonna be like, oh man, I really wish would stay here. There's no like, the Army's not going to beg for you to come back. And so what I would say is get what you can out of that experience and get what you can out of that job. Um, and then when you're not happy with it, move on. Uh, but there's a lot of opportunity to do things that, you just can't do in the civilian world. I mean, if you want to jump out of airplanes or,
Mm,
if you want to shoot in long range competitions and basically fly around the world and train different militaries, you can do that. I mean, you have to meet the physical and mental prerequisites, and you've got to jump through hoops. But like it is worth it if you want to do these things. If you want to do them enough, it will
mm-hmm.
become worth it if you want to do it. Which is, I couldn't have been happier in the profession that I was to get any of those opportunities. So, and if
Hmm.
that's what people want to do, I would 100% support it. If they
Yeah.
want to be a cook or they want to, work in the NBC world or they want to be an engineer, like more power to them. We need plenty of those people, and those jobs are awesome as well. And if that's what
Mm-hmm.
they want, then like it's a good environment to work in for sure. Yeah,
Hmm. What moment would you say you look back, you remember the most? Do you have like a moment or maybe an experience or something that
man,
when you look back on your time in, like that's the defining moment? Or was it just more the several, a compilation?
probably probably the most recent one. Um, it's probably the most memorable. Well, at least that I would say is like kind of um was the pinnacle of my like what made me feel like a Green Beret the most, I guess.
Mm.
That sounds really weird, but yeah. So we were in Africa, and we had been there. We are probably midway through the deployment, and we have watched a lot of do. So let me build a little context first. So I was at a
Mm-hmm.
base where a couple years back there were some third group soldiers that had been killed in an ambush. And there was a huge blowout over it. There were a lot of commands that got blamed. People got thrown under the bus, and these guys basically got told like, your men died for lack, because it was your fault, which it wasn't the case. And the team leader got screwed over, and a lot of dudes got screwed over.
Mm-hmm.
And this area in Africa, so we were at the same base that these guys were at, and so a lot of parts of this base had been memorials for these men that had been lost. The African military there had held this team and these men that had sacrificed their lives in very high regard, and because it was in Afghanistan, it was viewed as this like very taboo incident, right? Like, first of all, what are dudes doing in this place? Why are they dying? What the hell's
Hmm.
going on here? Was kind
Yeah.
of a lot of questions that were getting asked. And guys that were on my team that had also been active duty had been in that group, in that organization where those men had been killed. And so everybody came in with like one, very cautious of like the environment, and two, we really wanted to uh, kind of bring the guys that had done this to justice. And we
Mm-hmm.
also had a lot of French partners. And my goal as the team leader, because I um, was a very senior officer or captain at the time, I'd been on two other special forces teams. The guys that I'd been serving with, my two senior leaders have been on teams before. And so we knew what we needed to do kind of in order to be successful. And our constraints really were, the appetite to let our for our command to let us go out and do these things, because they were still worried, because guys had been killed previously, what's going to happen to these teams. So that kind of illustrates like the lack of comfort of having Americans go out and actually, shoot bad guys on behalf of America or on behalf of the
Mm-hmm.
African government. And so we were really stuck training these Nigerian special operations to go out and do these things. And these guys, these poor devils, have been getting killed by the bushel. So before we got there, there had been a bunch of bases where that had gotten overrun by ISIS. 30 to 60 guys had died each time this had happened, and it had been happening for a year plus.
Hmm.
And so we were going into a situation where these guys were getting shellacked by this terrorist organization. And oh, by the way, as Americans, you really can't go out and fix this problem. You have to train these guys to do it. And it was like, oh, this is the
Hmm.
perfect Green Beret problem. So halfway through, we'd been training these guys, and they'd had small wins here or there where they'd been able to kind of fight, fight and win. And it'd been these small kind of like confidence targets that they'd been able to succeed. And then finally one day, these guys basically got a really big win. And I mean, it was big enough to the point where it got media attention and attention from the French, and
Hmm.
it compounded within that time frame. It got blown out to everybody. My command understood it, everybody understood it, and then sequentially every week after that, it had basically turned this molehill into a mountain. And for us, by the time we left, we went from watching these guys die by
Hmm.
30 before we got there to they were inflicting those types of casualties upon the enemy. And oh, by the way, the French wanted to start supporting these guys, and the French started participating in these operations when originally they wanted to have nothing to do with it. And we had this weird post-colonial relationship where the French didn't want to speak to the Nigerians, and the Nigerians didn't want to have anything to do with these white devils. And at the end of everything, like, we literally left, and it was like leaving an actual functioning organization and family, where
Hmm.
these guys, we were able to hand it off to the other team, and then that team compounded on our successes. And when we were looking in the news, like, I still look in the news to just kind of see what's going on there, because I do have kind of a soft spot for that country. I see the success that my little box had kind of done well in. And so
Hmm.
that was kind of, that's really heartening to see that. And then, seeing the commanders that were there, like, genuinely asking us if we would come back. And it's one of the few times, I've trained a lot of partner forces. I've trained Colombians, I've trained Hondurans. And a lot of times it's like, thanks for coming out. Thanks for letting us shoot the ammo. We appreciate it. Yay, America. And these guys were literally like, when are you guys going to come back? We need your help. Like, I had never seen a more gracious host than the Nigerians that we got to train. And so it was really unique to
Hmm.
have guys that wanted us there to do that job, to learn and develop. And then, to see them grow up and, kick ass it was such a unique experience. And it was definitely kind of the highlight of my career, because I got to do it with, a bunch of really good dudes as well.
Hmm. Yeah.
Yeah.
Hmm. How would you how would you say that being in the military affected you as a person, your
Oof.
life?
I mean, it's pervaded my it's kind of pervaded my entire existence. So
Hmm.
I got it in 2006,
Yeah.
and I've dealt with it, or it's been a part of me since then. And I mean, it, it especially in special operations, it becomes a part of your identity, and it becomes really hard to kind of separate it, because it also
Mm.
kind of latches onto your psyche and your ego. And there's a lot of things you do on behalf of this, like, conceited pride, right? Like, I'll be damned
Hmm.
if I can't run, a 2 minute, or a 12:32 mile, right? Because
Right.
I'm a Green Beret.
Right.
Um, in the grand scheme of things, though, like, it has helped me kind of become it's helped me become a better father, and it's helped me become a it's it's definitely made me less empathetic in some times, and made me more
Mm.
empathetic in others. And it's
Sure.
really weird, because it's like, you don't really give two shits about weakness, right? You don't really care about, whether something hurts or whether something's uncomfortable. But at the same time, you can you because you've seen suffering and you've seen pain, you can kind of understand that, like, you
Hmm.
feel a little bit more for people that are in pain and suffering on kind of a more genuine scale.
Sure.
But,
Sure.
like, yeah, it I don't know, it brings a little bit more context to, like, what stress is too. And so, like, a deadline at work really isn't much of a big deal when, you've got to stay up late and you're used to staying up late. And so it makes, what most people think are issues seem smaller. And at the same
Hmm.
time, it really it kind of retards your ability to read between the lines sometimes. In the military, it's most people are not. They're very
Mm.
blunt and they're very
Right.
direct, right?
Yep.
And so most military dudes who are even successful in the civilian job world will just be like, "Look, I'm a straight shooter. If something's messed up, I need you to tell me," because we really lack a lot of like that, corporate America tact where they say a thing and they don't really mean it, or they mean it but it just doesn't interpret the way that you think it does. It's like this
Right.
velvet dagger, right? And so
Right.
it's just like, hey man, just tell me I'm fucking up because I don't know what you're saying, kind of personality. So it's that kind of generic military thing, I think. Because I've always had kind of a weird sense of humor that it's outlasted my militariness, and so it's allowed me to kind of better transition the civilian world and in special operations,
Mm.
because it's not the lines between enlisted and officers so blurred. And especially in special forces, your job is to build rapport and ingratiate yourself to people from a different nation or a different culture. You kind of build this innate empathy, and so when you go into the civilian world, if you are capable of recalling those experiences and applying them to your everyday life, you seem very less like military. Like, you kind of take the gun out of conversations, you kind of take like the
Mm.
tacticalness out of things. You don't seem so much like a vet bro or whatever people want to call
Sure.
it.
Sure. None of this knife hand pointing, but an ability to have
Yeah.
empathy. Yeah.
And you still have
Huh.
it, right? It's still
Sure.
very much there, and people like can still smell it on you, but it's not nearly as like what when you see a dude that used to be in the Marines. He still has this haircut and this like square jaw and this like very like this attitude that just like screams Marine Corps or screams
Hmm.
infantry or whatever. Whereas SF dudes are like, I don't know if you just go to REI a lot, you're kind of granola,
Right.
or if you just like hang out at breweries. Like, what are you all about? Like, you can kind of ask a few questions and poke, like, okay, yeah, you're SF dude, I get it.
Sure. Sure.
Yeah.
Huh. Interesting. Yeah. The different kind of cultures that are bred through the different branches or the different
Right.
aspects, I guess. Yeah.
Yeah.
Hmm. Um. Any questions that you expected that I didn't ask?
Oh gosh,
I
man,
I
I don't
had
know.
one person tell me, I forget who it was. They were like, "I'm surprised you didn't ask this," and I was like, "Oh, I didn't even think about that."
Oh, I was kind of going to these. I was kind of going to these free anyways. Like,
Yeah.
I mean, you don't know what you don't know. It's I guess most people ask me about dive school because it's kind of unique in special forces, because most of the time SEALs are used to it. So I get a lot of like,
Mm.
how did you end up liking the water because you're in the Army question, or like what dive school was like, because it's usually a pretty rare school that most dudes go to, or you know that type of route. But it's usually,
Mm.
those are usually the questions I get is about
Right.
water.
Right. Did you? Well, yeah. Okay. So did you? I didn't even think about that. Was the school a Navy school, or was it who ran the dive school?
So the school is, so all the safety and procedure is overseen by the Navy. So like, because it deals with the water and it's all the like
Hmm.
aquatic shit, for lack of a better term. The Navy is the one that like builds the procedure, but it's ran by a bunch of Army dudes, that are just special operations divers. So you have like
Okay.
scuba school in the Army, and hard hat diving, which is the part of the engineer corps. And then you've got special operations diving, which is kind of like buds light, or like Navy
Sure.
SEAL light. And I hate that term because it doesn't do either of those organizations justice, unless you
Right.
explain
Right.
them in detail.
Yes.
But
Everybody's
like,
offended when you say that.
yeah, or like,
Yeah.
when you think of buds, SEALs are, they're using it as a method of like disabling boats. Like, they're doing their thing in the water, and really all we're doing is just using it as a platform to get from A to B, right? It's like Halo
Mm.
or jumping out of airplanes. We're just using one
Sure.
platform to get onto the ground so we can accomplish our mission. That being said, though, like, because it's in the water and it has all this inherent danger, the school itself is like extremely rigorous, and it is, I mean, it's nothing the Army makes you do is usually easy, but it's considered one of the harder schools because of, people's uncomfortability in the water and just the amount of time and fitness the level of fitness that you have to be at. So it's
Mm.
not, it is, the Navy oversees it, but it's ran by basically a bunch of sadistic assholes that just want to watch you
Right.
drown most of
Right.
the time.
We lived through this. Now it's your turn.
Right, exactly. And
Yeah.
it is very much like that. The interesting part about that school is like, and Special Operations does this really well, is they make the school the experience, right? And so, like, I can definitely say,
Mm.
the end of the Q course was the most, most Green Beret in nature training I ever had, because it was just so well planned and it was so well executed, and they had everything I needed in order to kind of like play the game of being a guerrilla. Similarly at dive school, I mean, you lived that life for 6 weeks. They fed you really well, they ran your ass off, and then they expected you to perform in the water, in a zero fail environment. And then when you finish your
Mm.
training, or not, when at the last day of your training or the last week of your training, when you did your final exercise, I mean, they went full bore. They tested every mechanism that they trained you in employing, and they had you do a 4K offset infill at night with no, with a Drager that
Mm.
had no bubbles, with 12 other dudes on a rope. And it was like, you get out of the water, or and almost any environment in training, and you're like, holy shit, I did this. You're like, this is what I wanted to become. And
Right.
most, they like develop you to be this, whatever, envision this vision that you thought you could attain. And it's like, as long as you keep trudging towards it, for the most part, if you're healthy, you can, you can achieve it. And it's pretty wild to kind of get there.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah, that's it. Yeah, I guess there's a lot of value in that high stress level type of training
Oh yeah.
to just and also kind of the generational aspect of it. The it was hard for us, and
Yeah.
we want to make sure that it's hard for you so that you can live up to this standard. It's not just, some sadist enjoying hurting somebody. It's like, look, you need to be able to survive in a situation so that we're passing on to you the what we received.
Oh,
Yeah.
and that's a really good illustration of like what makes a boss versus a leader, or whatever leadership conversation
Mm.
people want to get into. But it's like, the guys that inflict pain because the excuse is it just happened to them are usually guys that like don't understand the context of what stress really is. And usually within our community, it's inflicted because they want to inoculate you
Mm.
for the rigors of what's going to happen, right? And so they do this surf torture, at the end of at the midway between your training, because they want you to know, if you get messed up by a wave and all the stuff gets ripped off of you, how you can recover without killing everybody or without drowning. And
Sure.
so it's like, man, this is terrifying, and I'm getting the shit hazed out of me. But like, these guys are doing it for a reason, right? And like, all this pain and suffering is done for a reason. And it's like, everybody says like you sweat more in training, so you bleed less in combat. And
Mm.
the good instructors and the good guys that are doing that like understand and grasp that. And it's definitely in this organization, it still exists. I would say in the Army, for a larger part, I think some of that mentality has gone to the wayside because it hasn't been championed enough. And so, you know, they remove hazing out of basic training, or they remove hazing out of units or whatever. And they
Mm.
refer to it as hazing because it's it has a negative connotation.
Sure. Sure.
And there's plenty of it that does happen unnecessarily. But there's also instances where like it absolutely has to happen, and you have to have dudes at fucking suffer, because it will. I mean, it not only just builds character, but it builds this not emotional callous, fuck it, emotional and mental callous to be able to kind of do that job that is
Right.
dirty and unnecessary or necessary.
Yeah. And
Yeah,
survive at the end of it. Yeah.
right,
Hmm.
and maybe come out like not so fucked up. You know.
Mm. Sure. Yeah. Hmm. Yeah. Any thoughts or you have anything you wanted to mention or plug or promote?
Oh man. I don't really have anything to promote or plug.
Okay.
Yeah. No, not at all. No,
All
I
right.
really
Good to
appreciate
know.
the opportunity to chat though.
Yeah. No, I appreciate it. Yeah, like
Yeah.
it this was kind of last minute, so you got me out of a spot. I usually don't get meta on the show, but I'm right up tight with I'm recording right before I release. Let's put it that way. So
Okay. Nice.
this is fantastic that you're able to jump
No,
on,
good.
and yeah, I appreciate it. It's I always enjoy just having a good conversation and learning more. I mean, like this is why I do it. Really, is I'm pretty selfish, and I just enjoy talking to people and kind of getting a viewpoint on what it's like to be in the military. So you know,
I do enjoy kind of taking the mystique out of it because it's
sure,
when people think about special operations, they think about like the Osama bin Laden hit, or they think about Delta Force, or they think about just like cloak
sure,
and dagger stuff. And there's nothing. I mean, if anybody ever says like, "Oh, it's classified," like my my military profile is classified, you're like, this person is probably full of shit. And
right,
really, it's the most people go into the military because it's a sense of patriotism, and a lot of times, you know, even in post 9/11, even after they saw what was going on in Iraq, they it's hard to grasp what you're going to be doing day to day. And like we'd said before, if you're in the infantry, you think you're going to be suffering in some building in a firefight for the next 15 months or 12 months or whatever. But really, like
right.
when you're back home, you're waking up at 5 in the morning and going for runs, then you're going to ranges, and you're kind of just doing like, regular bro stuff, or, what your job is. And then when you deploy, it's really not entirely all that much different aside from, the occasional terrifying moment. And it's,
Mm-hmm.
it is hard to uh, kind of take that mystique away or explain in greater detail if all people know is Blackhawk Down, or crazy military movies or whatever. And
Sure.
it gets, I mean, it is a weird experience because it's such a microcosm that veterans are, right? Like you've got some veterans that are totally against the military when they get out, and it's a fucking, they view it as this sham, and it's nothing but a, like, I did war crimes, and I had to perpetuate these war crimes, and I dealt with these guys. And it's this like, you have so many you have such a strange spectrum of individuals that come out of these organizations that you would never see in, you know, I don't know, working for some job in corporate America. But in the army, it's this, or the military in general, it's just this weird conglomeration of personalities. And it's so interesting to listen to podcasts or listen to other people and see where their experiences arose from out of the military, and where they've kind of grown as people, which is
Mm.
just it's a fucking wild thing to think about. Because there's plenty of Green Berets that I you know vigorously disagree with politically, or morally or whatever. But like
Mm-hmm.
we basically did the same thing, right? We followed the same career track, and then where we got to was just basically a individual experience or an outlook on what we had done, even in the same situation potentially. And it's just such an interesting way to think about, a clone of me could be completely different because he saw this firefight as, this unnecessary violent action upon innocent people or dirt farmers or whatever the fuck, which is
Mm-hmm.
just such a weird thing to consider.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. What I was just wondering. You mentioned like Black Hawk Down, all that. Do you think, and maybe you don't have an opinion on this, but what do you think? Like war movies overall have been good or bad for culture, or for maybe I should say for people's. Well, I'm sure you're going to say it's bad for people's understanding of the military because that's kind of what you were referring to. But just like for America in general, do you think war movies have had a positive or negative, or more positive or more negative impact overall?
It's really strange because it varies. It's like a gradient, and it really depends on the movie. There's some that are really good
Mm.
for the community, and there's some that are
Sure.
just like an iota short of propaganda. And like when you look at 12 Strong with Chris Hemsworth or whatever, and it's like these Green Berets that
Mm.
had infiltrated into Afghanistan, and it's such a travesty to have that movie in the way that it is, because you have the officer and you know who that is because he's the star, and then the rest of those NCOs and those dudes, nobody knows who the fuck they are. You don't even know who the
Mm.
team sergeant is, right? Like you could line those guys
Right.
up and you're like, which one's the team sergeant based off of how you saw this movie, and nobody'd be like, I don't know. In reality, that team sergeant and that team leader in that warrant were running that fucking show, and you just don't see who the difference is. And then, riding
Sure.
a horse into combat is just so overdone. And what it really should have been was a TV series, and it could have broken down the personalities and these. I mean, it could have been like, it really could have been, for lack of a better term, a love story to this incident, which changed a lot of American history,
Mm.
and could have let you into kind of the life of Green Berets and how these dudes' families interacted, and how they fought this war with literally 24 dudes. Like 12 dudes initially went into Afghanistan and changed the history of that nation with some
Mhm.
air support and kind words. Like holy shit. And all you saw in Horse Soldiers were these dudes got on horses and did a
Right.
few things and blew stuff up, and it's like, man, it's such a disservice to the organization and the men that did that just because
Yeah.
they
Sure.
wanted to make a quick buck or whatever. And then when you look at like the Outpost, which is incident in Afghanistan where a couple guys, or one guy won the Medal of Honor, and I think one got a Silver Star. I'm being a complete shit not remembering, but like you see that, and I mean, you see the progression of the characters, and you see them in kind of like their unfiltered form, and then you see them die, and it's like that's probably as
Mm.
real as it gets. Is like you see a dude you like or a dude you hate, and it's very like Game of Thrones in the sense it's like this is how reality is like both these dudes, one dude you liked and hated, both fucking die in this Humvee, and
Mhm.
this reluctant leader has to make these choices and watch his men die as they're in this untenable situation. And the movie ends well or poorly depending on how you view it. As like, these guys just get on a helicopter and fuck off, and then they have to relive the incident that went on after all this trauma and violence
Hmm.
and crazy shit happened. So I think that's a great illustration of like how bad it can be. And I say this all the time on Twitter. I think Saving Private Ryan is probably one of the best movies, war movies, and it
Mm.
spans multiple generations, because not only because I think Tom Hanks is an amazing actor, but like, you look at the interaction, and you know who the senior NCO is, you know who the captain is, you know the relationship they're supposed to have, and you see kind of the interactions evolve across this entire movie. And then an additional layer is like every single one of these guys you kind of understand as a person. You hear their regret, and then they relive their regret, or their death is kind of this Greek tragedy. And it always brings me back to the medic, because my dad was a medic, and so like I have this like soft spot for medics. But
Mm.
this medic was sitting in a church, and this really unique moment of when he talked about, his mother would come home and he would pretend he was asleep, and he didn't know why, but his mom just came in because she wanted to talk, and then she'd leave him alone. And then as he's dying, he's crying out for his mother, and it's like the sad, subtle irony of like, this dude realizing his regret upon his
Hmm.
death. And
Yeah.
there's a bunch of other ones where one of the individuals who's Jewish is, these POWs are walking by, and he's like, showing that he's Jewish. And the irony is this dude gets, brutally murdered with a knife, with being whispered to sleep by this Nazi, as he was kind of like flaunting his Judaism. It's just like there's that whole movie is full of these weird, ironic, like Greek tragedy style deaths, and it's just like that is that's
Hmm.
like a swan song, or like a perfect illustration of kind of how interactions and how like this how sour tragedies are across from, or exist within our community, where like it's always the best of us, or always the best of the community that are always dying. It's never never the dudes you want to, if that's a more morbid way to say it. But like, it's
Sure.
always the younger, you know team captains, or it's always the the team sergeants or the war heroes, or like there's no such thing as war heroes. There's just war survivors. The heroes are always the ones that end up fucking dying or whatever, like that kind of
Mm,
mentality. So it is interesting. It really does depend on which movie you decide to watch. But there's good ones, and then there's you can definitely tell which ones are propaganda. And Blackhawk Down is in the middle of that fine line because it definitely has that kind of propaganda-ish
mm.
personality, but at
Sure,
the same
sure.
time it does a really good illustration of what happened, and there's definitely no like pulling punches about, how shitty of a situation that was and how those dudes ended up dying, and like, no nobody flew back screaming, like Team America with a flag waving somewhere. Like it was just this like sad, kind of unfortunate ending.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. I always enjoy stories more. Not enjoy. That's the wrong term. Um, I'm more impacted by stories that, even if they're not specifically a true story, they have an element of realism where
Yeah.
maybe the hero does die.
Mhm.
In American movies, you know that the hero is gonna live to the end,
Right.
or else just have a really heroic sacrifice that saves the whole world or something.
Right.
Whereas in real life, like you're saying, sometimes it's the cool guy that dies and the scumbag goes home, or something like that. So yeah, stories like that where there is that tragedy and you're confronted with it, you're not protected from it. You
Right.
know,
It's
I
almost
think
like
that's
it's
meaningful.
almost like its own traumatic movie experience in some senses, which is kind of odd.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah, I have in the past asked vets, "Oh, what's your favorite war movie?" And I
Like,
quickly learned that's a very civilian thing to say, and don't say that. So
see, I
yeah.
it doesn't bother me too much. I mean, I watch
Mhm.
them, and it's there's some of them that I just can't stand because you're like, we get the like, oh, the uniform's fucked up, or like that would never
Right.
happen, or that always exists, and so it's like, you watch Jack Reacher or John Wick or whatever, and it's you just roll your eyes. But usually it's,
Right.
it's like, Band of Brothers or Saving Private Ryan's really good. I did
Mhm.
like The Outpost is kind of, it kind of hits a little bit closer. There's
Hmm.
a there's a Hulu special about the team in Africa that had those individuals
Mm.
that died, and it's called 3212 Unredacted, and it's more of a documentary on what happened, but it is really interesting, and it kind of illustrates on the larger term of like how commands and special operations kind of interact in those environments. So it is good, to kind of see that, even though it's not really a war movie.
Thank you for listening to this episode of How I Embraced the Suck. If you enjoyed the show, tell a friend. And as my Girl Scout den mother used to say, stay frosty.
Oh, the truth. Like, yeah, you don't talk about Scientology to non-Scientologists, right? Yeah, that's probably what it is. Just, yeah, they wouldn't understand anyways.